just to say, first of all, that it's good to be back after the brief break I gave myself for the Orthodox Easter. Well, I'll be returning briefly, touching on the question of Easter shortly, but let me first do what I usually do, which is to give a brief account of the situation on the battlefronts. Now, there's not been very much news, probably because the Easter holiday has affected both reporting from the battlefronts and perhaps conceivably even a certain amount of military activity. However, it is the case that Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner organization, arranged for a large release of prisoners, Ukrainian prisoners, captured by the Wagner organization over the course of the fighting in Bakhmut, and this was timed for the Easter holiday. And there were reports yesterday that the Wagner organization has captured 2 more districts in Bakhmut itself. Now, my impression is that the advances in Bakhmut are incremental but steady. There's been lots of reports that over the last couple of hours, days, Ukraine has carried out various attempts at counterattacks in Bakhmut, in the Avdiivka area, and that there's now a big force being concentrated near Kupiansk in Kharkov region. Kupiansk is this town on the Oskol River where, until recently, the Russian military was reported as making significant advances. Anyway, the consistent story about all of these Ukrainian attacks at the moment, and they should not be confused with this big Ukrainian counteroffensive that is being prepared. Anyway, the consistent reports say that all of these counterattacks have been repelled and that in every single case, the Russians continue to move steadily forward. And as I said, in Bakhmut, they seem to be taking 1 or 2 districts at a time, usually day by day. And one gets the sense that there really isn't very much of Bakhmut still left, which is under Ukrainian control. Again, it's not fully easy to get a precise picture because, as I said, the information from the battlefronts is so sketchy, has been so sketchy over the last 36 hours or so. One thing I will say is that Anatol Lieven, a correspondent, a commentator who writes principally for Responsible Statecraft, which is the website of the Quincy Institute, has just been on a trip to Ukraine. He took a strongly realist position about the war, about the conflict between the West and Russia. Prior to the war, he was strongly in favour of some kind of a agreement by the West to at least take seriously Russian diplomatic proposals that draft treaties. However, since the war began, he has been in general, rather very much more so on the Ukrainian side. And he's just been to Ukraine and he's just had a discussion there. He's travelled around various places. I didn't find most of his comments. He's given an interview to, I think it was Michael Vlachos, which is reported by Responsible Statecraft. He's given an interview. I didn't find it particularly insightful or interesting. Lieven is emphatically not someone, I think, who one goes to for information about war. He's not a military person in any sense. But he does provide some insight as to the nature of the fighting, and it comes from Ukrainian military veterans that he's spoken to whilst he was in Ukraine, and they do explain a great deal about the nature of the fighting in eastern Ukraine. He says various things struck me when talking to military veterans. One was the extent to which the war in the east has become a very bloody stalemate. I don't agree about that, by the way. I'll come to that in a moment. And then he goes on to say that it's a war of artillery, but it's also a war of mines. One of the reasons why the front doesn't move much is that the ground is absolutely infested with mines, both anti-personnel mines and anti-tank mines. And as one soldier said, the Russian approach is not human waves, as has sometimes been described in the Western media. The Russians will pound and pound with artillery, in which they have superiority, and then if they think they have crushed the Ukrainian positions, will send in small groups of soldiers to try to occupy them, after which they will bring up reinforcements. And that is exactly the pattern of the fighting since the summer in most of the battle zones, in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, or wherever. It is not, however, a stalemate, at least not in my opinion. It is a war of attrition, and it is a war of attrition which Ukraine is losing. It is suffering far heavier casualties than Russia. There's been a recent study by some NATO officials who've been complaining, or ex-NATO officials who've been saying that, which has been apparently released in Canada, which has been criticising Ukrainian tactics. They say that Ukraine's losses have been inordinately high because they are up against this kind of attrition war which the Russians have been waging against them. And the result is that, as I said, Russia conserves its forces, gradually presses forward in Donbass, grinds the Ukrainians down, and then eventually, of course, as always happens in attrition wars, at some point, the weaker side breaks, and very often at that point the war ends very fast. That's how the First World War ended, for example, perhaps the most famous attrition war of all. The two sides were dug in for years on the Western Front. There were various ebbs and flows in the fighting. Ultimately, the Allies had superiority, and eventually the Germans broke. In the autumn of 1918, the Germans broke. And of course, it also happened during the American Civil War. And by the way, and on a different topic, it also happened during the Syrian War. I remember that after the Russians intervened in the Syrian conflict in 2015, most of 2016 saw relatively marginal advances, or so it seemed, by the various forces. In fact, with the backing of Russian air power, it was becoming increasingly clear that it was the Syrian government and its military that was slowly, incrementally gaining the advantage. And then, after the fighting in 2016, when the decisive battle of Aleppo was won by the Syrian army, 2017 saw extremely rapid advances by the Syrian military, which basically swept through northern Syria and gradually, very rapidly pacified the territories around Damascus. So attrition wars can appear to be stalemated for a very long time, but that doesn't actually give one a true sense of what's happening. One has to look instead at which side is inflicting the greater casualties, at which side is doing the bigger damage, and of course, as fortified positions held by the weaker side gradually fall, that puts the stronger side in a position where eventually they can advance fast. So I suspect that's probably what we're going to see eventually in the Ukraine war. It is taking longer, a lot longer than the Syrian war did, because obviously Ukraine is a much bigger country. The Ukrainian military that started the war was much more powerful. The West has supplied substantial amounts of weaponry to Ukraine. It's provided extensive financial and economic assistance. But notwithstanding all of that, Ukraine is gradually, inexorably being ground down. It's been ground down all along the line of contact, but specifically in the most heavily fortified area of its defense lines, which is in Bakhmut and the rest of Donbass, where the Russians have turned Ukraine's heavily fortified positions to its advantage, taking, if you like, a siege war approach to the war, gradually, as I said, taking places step by step and inflicting inordinate casualties on Ukraine whilst they do so. And Ukraine, for its part, has tried to maintain the integrity of its defences by deploying repeated reinforcements to try to plug the holes as these appear. And whilst this can slow Russian advances for weeks or sometimes even months, as we've seen in all sorts of places like, say, Marinka, for example, or Vuhledar more recently, the cost is always extremely high, higher than Ukraine over time can afford to pay. That is the Russian strategy. It was outlined by General Surovikin back in October. It's a broad front strategy, as I said, waging attrition, conserving forces. The Russian ambassador to Britain recently said that the ratio of losses in the war is 7 Ukrainians for every Russian, and I think that may be roughly correct. Ukraine started with a smaller manpower pool than Russia. I'm going to come to that shortly, by the way, the implications of that shortly, by the way. But steadily, remorselessly, Ukraine is being ground down. It's been ground down in Bakhmut, it's been ground down in Avdiivka, it's been ground down in all sorts of other places. Anyway, how much longer the fight for Bakhmut is going to take, not for me, perhaps, to say. But as I said, I doubt that there's very much of this shattered town still left under Ukrainian control. And perhaps suddenly, out of nowhere, we will hear the announcement that the Russians are in full control of the entirety of Bakhmut and that Ukrainian resistance there has been broken, and that whatever is left of the Ukrainian forces have finally retreated from the place. Prigozhin, in that long discussion of his that I discussed the other day, spoke about the irrationality of President Zelensky and of his leadership in trying to hold out in Bakhmut, about the way in which the Ukrainians themselves have gone backwards and forwards, dithered between what to do, whether to pull out of Bakhmut, whether to reinforce there, whether to keep on fighting, whether to abandon the town, whether to counterattack, all kinds of things. They understand at some level that this attrition battle that they're fighting is working against them. They've been advised by the United States and the Western allies to stop fighting this war as a war of attrition. But we see from Anatol Lieven's piece and from Prigozhin's commentary that ultimately they feel that they have no choice but to continue to fight the war in that kind of way, which is the way in which the Russians want them to fight it. Now, on another front, there's been an awful lot of discussion about the critical state of the Ukrainian air defense system. Brian Beletic has perhaps been the best, again, commentator on this topic in the new Atlas. We've seen increasing deployment of the Russian Air Force. We see Russian bombers dropping, as I said, these big, glided, precision-guided bombs on Ukrainian defences, something that has not been happening previously in the war. And according to the London Times, the chief of Ukraine's air defense system, a man called Ignat, has now come forward and has acknowledged that his air defense system, that Ukraine's air defense system is now in a critical state, and it cannot provide the all-embracing cover for Ukraine that it previously did. So, contrary to what some people have been saying, that long Russian missile offensive against the Ukrainian energy system that began in October, and which, by the way, still sporadically continues, I anticipate that at some point we're going to see more Russian missile strikes against Ukraine, perhaps against energy targets, and of course drone attacks with Uranium-2 drones as well. It has had what was clearly its primary purpose. It has achieved its primary purpose. Ukraine's air defense system has been depleted to critical levels, both in advance of Ukraine's own offensive and what the Russian ambassador to Britain says will be Russia's offensive, presumably when the Ukrainian offensive has been repelled. Now, on the topic of that offensive, the Ukrainian offensive, there's been a long article in the Financial Times, and I'm going to come to it because, of course, it gives us another view of the prospects of this offensive. And it says, the article reads, Ukraine's high-risk bid to breach Russia's fortified front line. And the opening paragraph, I'm not going to read the whole article, which is behind a paywall, and where much of it is speculative, by the way. But anyway, it goes on to say, on one side will be around 35,000 Ukrainian soldiers bolstered by Western battle tanks. They will face more than 140,000 enemy troops along a 950-kilometre front line. Separating the two forces will be a deadly obstacle course of mines, earthworks, and tank-stopping bollards set by the Russians. Now, I have to say straight away, these are very interesting figures. 35,000 Ukrainian troops, Ukrainian soldiers, are presumably the force that Ukraine is said to have put together for this offensive. Now, that is an interesting number because Big Serge, in that article that I discussed yesterday, or rather the day before yesterday, in which he did a breakdown of the state of Ukraine's military, he also calculated that the Ukrainian force that is going to be committed to the offensive will number around 30,000 men. I was a little sceptical. I thought that it might be more than that, but we see that the Financial Times seems to agree with Big Serge. It puts the number also at around 35,000 men. And it says that it will face a force of 140,000 enemy troops. Now, how is that last figure reached. Certainly, if we're talking about 140,000 troops, I think that the Russian forces in Ukraine number substantially more than that. And Putin, some months ago, spoke about Russia having built up a reserve of 160,000 men. Is that 140,000 that the Financial Times is talking about? Is that the reserve that Putin was speaking about a few months ago? I am assuming that it is. That's, of course, only a guess because, of course, the Financial Times doesn't provide us with an explanation. However, I'm going to suggest that these numbers, both the Ukrainian number and the Russian number, for the number of troops on the battle lines, that both of these numbers do come from Western official sources. That's fairly clear from the rest of the article that the author of this article, the journalist who's writing it, John Paul Rathbone, has been carefully briefed. And I think already we see a problem because 35,000 Ukrainian soldiers are going to be committed to attacking 140,000 Russian troops. Now, it does imply that these Russian troops are located along the 950-kilometer front line, and that's probably true. But if this is the reserve that is being talked about here, the Russian reserve force that's being talked about here, the Russians can presumably concentrate it when Ukraine launches its offensive, assuming, of course, that that offensive takes place in one place, which, given that only 35,000 Ukrainian troops are going to be involved, may be asking rather a lot, by the way. I would have thought that with 35,000 Ukrainian troops only participating in this offensive, Ukraine would be wanting to disperse its forces. It's a guess. Anyway, notice again that the Ukrainians will face a deadly obstacle course of mines, earthworks and tank-stopping bollards. And that takes us back to Lieven, and he talked about the importance of mines, and of course he also spoke about artillery and the fact that the Russians have a predominance of it. And again, in my previous program, I gave an account based on I read from an account in The Spectator, the British magazine The Spectator, describing the experiences of a British volunteer fighting for the Ukrainian forces, and how essentially what he's up against, what Ukraine is up against all along the front line, is this enormous Russian artillery preponderance, and the effect of that, and the impossibility, in a way, of advancing or holding territory up to now against this enormous artillery, this weight of artillery that the Russians are able to bring to bear. Anyway, I'm going to continue to read this Financial Times article because it's quite interesting. It says, the day is soon approaching when Ukraine will attempt to breach Russia's frontline fortifications. The latest speculation, by the way, is that the offensive is going to take place. The start date for the offensive is the 30th of April. Well, we will see. And then he goes on to say, the stakes in this first phase of its spring counteroffensive could not be higher. Success or failure will shape the battlefield and determine the strength of Kiev's hand in any eventual negotiations with Moscow to resolve the conflict. Note that the article appears to accept that Ukraine cannot achieve an outright victory. It's merely fighting in order to strengthen its diplomatic position. But anyway, I won't probe on that anymore. And then it goes on to say, but the fighting promises to be a hard slog, warn military officials and analysts. For one, breaching operations are exceptionally hard to perform, as they require all military units, from artillery and tanks to intelligence gathering and engineers, to work synchronously. And then we have Nick Gunnell, a former officer in the Britain's Royal Engineers with extensive experience of breaching operations. I wonder where, by the way. I'm not aware that the British military has had much recent experience of breaching operations. Maybe the one instance was the 1991 Iraq War, but anyway, I'll press on. Anyway, Mr. Gunnell is then reported as saying it takes a giant orchestration of combined arms. Everyone has to play a role. It's a very high task. And adding to the difficulties is Ukraine's lack of air superiority. The last big battle involving Western tanks was in 2003, when a US-led coalition battled Iraqi forces equipped with Soviet-era T-72s. But the Allied forces then were supported by ground attack aircraft and Apache helicopters. In fact, there's no comparison. This time it's the Russians, obviously, who have air superiority and missile superiority and air defense superiority and, of course, artillery superiority as well. And then it goes on to say, on the ground, Ukrainian forces will have Western-supplied heavy weaponry, such as British Challenger and German-made Leopard tanks, US-supplied Bradley fighting vehicles, and self-propelled Archer howitzers. These are howitzers supplied by Britain. But they will lack decisive air cover to stop Russian fighter jets that could, as Gunnell put it, squash Ukraine's specialist engineering vehicles as they try to breach Russian fortifications. The West has so far resisted requests to provide Kiev with advanced fighter jets, such as US F-16s. And then we have another British officer, Ben Barry, saying the classic approach in a land offensive is to break out into the enemy's rear in one area or several and deliver a concentrated blow against the enemy's centre of gravity. Successful examples without air superiority are rare. And he cited Israel's land attack on Egyptian positions in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. I'm not sure whether my understanding is that Israel did have air superiority in that war, but again, perhaps I'm getting that wrong. But then it goes on to say that it's no secret that the counteroffensive is imminent, and by May, the ground will be firm enough for vehicle manoeuvres and more Western-supplied armour, plus engineering equipment, such as the armoured bridge layers in the US's latest $2.6 billion military aid package to Kiev will have arrived. And we're then given a description that the Russian defences typically consist of a minefield followed by lines of pyramid-shaped concrete bollards called dragon's teeth that slow down mechanised units, another minefield lines beyond them, with a line of trenches and dugouts 400 kilometres back, and an anti-tank ditch behind them. And then Gunnell says you need to pick the most advantageous spot, although that is a very open-ended concept. It may be where Ukraine has good logistics nearby or at Russia's weakest point, although that might be Ukraine's weakest spot too. Either way, the first step is to fire a 200 millimeter hose packed with explosives that clears a 5-meter wide lane of mines for tanks and other armour to traverse. The next is to clear the dragon's teeth, perhaps using tanks fitted with ploughs. The last step is to breach the ditches with specialised bridging equipment. It's all about momentum and speed, but things always go wrong, so you have to be prepared. If a tank plough breaks down, it has to be recovered, or a second lane prepared. The hardest part is synchronizing the various parts, and Ukraine's army, whilst adept at small maneuvers, has limited experience of combined operations on this scale. Furthermore, Ukraine's forces have lost a large share of their most experienced soldiers, having suffered an estimated 120,000 casualties. And it doesn't look to me as if it's a particularly promising operation that's been described here. The obstacles that the fortifications create are enormous. And in fact, we're told that there's 4 layers of these defences, at least that's what the Russians have said. And this is an offensive which supposedly has to be carried out by 35,000 troops facing 140,000 Russian troops. As I said, I'm a little at a loss to understand those numbers, but there we go. So, that's the Financial Times. It corresponds with what we hear from other sources. It does seem as if this is going to be a very tall order for Ukraine to succeed in this offensive, in which the stakes, as the Financial Times admits, are so high, and even analysts explaining all of this to the Financial Times concede as much. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the battlefronts. I do want to now discuss Easter and what has happened over Easter. Once more, there were reports that Ukraine shelled Donetsk. Seems extraordinary that they would do that, but they appear to have used, if Russian accounts are correct, they appear to have used multiple rocket launch systems to shell Donetsk. It's been suggested that they were shelling the main cathedral in Donetsk. I have to say, I find that astonishing on an Easter Sunday that they would do that. I can't understand the logic of that, the military logic of that at all. And of course, conflicts are taking place all across Ukraine as Ukraine continues its efforts to suppress the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is oriented, or has been previously oriented, or at least is in some historic relationship with the Orthodox Church in Russia. And I have to say, I was reading a lot about this over the course of Easter Sunday, and I found it all very distressing reading, very dismaying reading indeed, but none of it, I'm afraid, surprised me. And I did read one report which said that there's been some voices, some people within the Ukrainian government, within the Ukrainian intelligence service in particular, who are starting to think that the frontal assault on the Orthodox Church, which the Zelensky government has resorted to over the last few months, that has been a mistake, that it's caused Ukraine a great deal of embarrassment internationally. It's not played well at all internationally, and that it's also had an effect of creating divisions within Ukraine itself and tied up Ukrainian security forces in attempts to clear churches and arrest church officials in a way that, as I said, is causing a lot of anger amongst a part of the Russian population. Going back, by the way, to Anatol Lieven's piece in Responsible Statecraft, I noticed that he doesn't mention the church conflict at all. And I can't imagine that this, especially in this part of the world, is a matter of indifference, even to some of the people that he spoke to. But anyway, I'm not going to say more about that. All I will say is that I personally find all this extremely difficult to see. I have to also say that the suggestions that because the Orthodox Church in Ukraine has some kind of historic connection to Russia. By the way, I would say that the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, to my understanding, has condemned the Russian decision to launch its special military operation in Ukraine. But, putting that aside, the fact that it has some historic connection to the Russian Orthodox Church, it doesn't seem to me to justify, remotely justify, these kind of attacks on clergymen and churches that we have seen. After all, just saying, during the Second World War, the Pope was based in Italy, in Rome, as he always is. Italy at that time was, of course, allied with Germany. There was a substantial sentiment within parts of the Catholic Church in continental Europe that was, shall we say, sympathetic to the Axis powers. The leader of the pro-German government in Slovakia, Father Teasel, was a Catholic priest. Well, nobody, so far as I'm aware, in the West suggested that Catholic churches should be seized and Catholic hierarchs should be arrested because, as I said, the Catholic Church was connected to the Pope, based in Italy, and parts of the Catholic Church in Europe might be said to have sympathies with the other side. I appreciate some people won't like this analogy and will try to pick holes in it, but I'm just making it. It seems to me that people who support this Ukrainian assault on the church, on the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, need to think very carefully about what they're supporting and perhaps ought to examine their own consciences, because to my mind, it is clearly wrong. Anyway, moving forward, the big news, as far as I'm concerned, the big political news is in terms of the overall geopolitical conflict, is divided into two parts. The first is the decision of the Chinese Defense Minister, Li Shangfu, recently just appointed to the post of Defense Minister of China, his decision to visit Moscow and Putin's extraordinary decision to meet with the Chinese Defense Minister on Easter Sunday, a day when Putin himself attended church and when he was apparently taking the day off. And Putin doesn't give himself that many days off. Easter Sunday is one, and nonetheless he met the Chinese Defense Minister on that day. The other big news is the fighting in Sudan, which I'm going to come to at the end of this program. But let's first of all deal with the visit of Li Shangfu to Moscow. And we've had from the Kremlin a transcript of the introductory meetings between Putin and Li Shangfu, and it comes together with a photographic with pictures, photographs showing this meeting taking place. We see Li Shangfu being greeted by Putin, Putin shaking his hand. We see them all sitting round the famous oval table where Putin regularly meets visitors. Importantly, Putin is sitting much closer to Li Shangfu than he has been in meeting visitors from the West. And the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, is also there. And he is also obviously shown prominently in the photographic study. And we've had comments. These are the first reported comments, and we start with Putin. And this is what the Kremlin says that he said to Li Shangfu. You have arrived in Russia following the visit to our country by our great friend, my friend, President of the People's Republic of China, Comrade Xi Jinping. I would like to emphasize once again that this is a very productive visit. Of course, we discussed military-to-military cooperation amongst other topics. Our two countries have maintained positive momentum in expanding our economic, social, cultural and educational ties. We have also been proactive in our military-to-military relations by regularly sharing actionable insights and cooperating on defence matters. We also hold joint military exercises in various theatres of operation, including in the Far East, Europe, at sea, on land, as well as in the air. I do believe that this constitutes a major track for strengthening the trust-based strategic relationship between the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. We are glad to see you. I know that you have a packed and quite extensive program for your visit. I am certain that your visit will be very effective. And in fact, we now know that Li Shangfu's visit has lasted for 3 days. He's met with lots of top Russian military officials, and I've seen one photographic study of him visiting what I understand to be the Academy of the Russian General Staff. And then Li Shangfu also has made various comments to Putin over the course of these meeting. These are the introductory comments that he made, and he's reported as having said, thank you so much for finding the time to have this meeting with me. I know that today is a holiday, but still you have found the time to receive me. That is a great honour for me. First of all, allow me to convey to you the warmest greetings and the best wishes on behalf of Chinese President Xi Jinping. In 2017, a military delegation visited Russia to take part in the meeting of the Commission for Military Technical Cooperation, and I was a member of this body at the time. Today, I am back in Russia, and which gives me great joy. As of late, military and technical cooperation between China and Russia is developing very well. This is making a major contribution to maintaining global and regional security. I have arrived in Russia today. There are plans to implement your agreements with President Xi Jinping reached during his March visit to Moscow. This is my first foreign visit after I became defense minister. I specially chose Russia so as to emphasize the special nature and strategic significance of our bilateral relations. Our countries established bilateral relations over 70 years ago. Relations between our armed forces are growing stronger with every passing day. Naturally, the diplomacy of leaders plays a key role here. You set strategic goals for our development. In addition, your personal friendship with the President of China plays a major role in this process, and everyone in China knows this. And then he discusses the fact that Putin and Xi have met over 40 times. He goes on to say, we have a very strong relationship that goes beyond the Cold War era military and political alliances. Note those words. This relationship hinges on the principles of non-alignment and non-confrontation with third parties, and these principles are very stable. Under your strategic leadership and that of the President of China, we are actively developing cooperation in practical spheres. Our relations have already entered a new era. He then talks, this is Li Shangfu, about the fact that for 13 years China has been Russia's major trade partner and trade relations are improving. And then he finishes by saying that Mr. Xi Jinping has advanced several major initiatives, including a civilizational initiative that has to do with global development. To the best of our knowledge, the Russian side has a positive opinion of these initiatives. Cooperation continues to develop at all levels, and we will continue this cooperation in the interests of the entire world's development. Now, a number of things. Firstly, note that Li Shangfu chose Russia as the first country that he would visit. In former times, when a Chinese defense minister was newly appointed, more often than not, the first country he would visit would be the United States. In this case, Li Shangfu chose to visit Russia. And Li Shangfu, as he's careful to point out, has a long history of close interactions with the Russians. He has been, in some ways, China's point man in developing the military cooperation, the military relationship with Russia. But let's go back and just go and read some of the points that Li Shangfu is making. And can I say that these introductory comments strongly come across to me as having been prepared in advance and probably agreed by the two sides in advance, both Putin's and Li Shangfu's, before they were published. So we read that this is from Li Shangfu's comments, military and technical cooperation between Russia and China is developing very well. This is making a major contribution to maintaining global and regional security. So that's an interesting insight. It suggests that this relationship has a global strategic perspective. In other words, it's intended to strengthen both countries against the United States. It provides an anchor in the international system against any moves against either side by the United States. And Li Shangfu says, relations between our armed forces are growing stronger with every passing day. And he says that the relationship goes beyond Cold War era military and political alliances. Now, in the 1950s, the Soviet Union and China were formal allies. But Li Shangfu says that the military relationship between China and Russia today goes beyond what was the case during the Cold War of the 1950s, that the Chinese-Russian military relationship is even greater, it's even stronger, it's more intensive than it was then. And by the way, about that, I have absolutely no doubt at all. To my knowledge, back in the 1950s, the Chinese and Russian military leaderships were nowhere near as tightly integrated as they are today. We did not have situations where Chinese and Russian military officials, for example, were intimately interconnected to the point of being permanently based in each other's operational headquarters, and where the Chinese and Soviet militaries of the 1950s era regularly carried out joint exercises, including command and control exercises, as they do today. So we can see that this is a very close relationship indeed. We're told carefully that this is not an alliance directed against any third parties, that it's based on principles of non-alignment and non-confrontation with third parties, and that these principles are very stable. That's again what Li Shangfu tells us. But it's not difficult to read that behind all these words, this relationship, this burgeoning military relationship, is intended to strengthen the Chinese-Russian position vis-a-vis the United States. And the fact that this meeting has taken place, the fact that Li Shangfu chose to visit Russia first, the fact that he's spending at least 3 days there, the fact that he's met with Putin on Easter Day, that Putin took time off on Easter Day to meet him, the fact that Li Shangfu is apparently meeting up, virtually the entire Russian military leadership, Shoigu, Gerasimov, who knows which others, that he's visiting the General Staff's Academy, all of those things. That highlights how deep the relationship has become, how friendly it has become, how important to each side it has become. And as I said, it's clearly intended to present a united front, principally, first and foremost, against the United States. Now, there's been lots of discussions by many people about the solidity of this relationship between the Chinese and the Russians. I think it's fair to say that it's only in the last few months that the United States and the West has finally woken up to the extent of this relationship and its overall depth. And I think that the Western powers have been in denial about this for far too long. Now, if you go to the Duran, our main channel, you will find that there a long interview which I conducted together with Professor Glenn Deepen with the former Indian ambassador to Moscow, an ambassador who, as I've said in previous programs, his term as ambassador ended in 2021, in other words, fairly recently, and who is therefore very well informed about Indian government thinking. And towards the end of the program, the Indian ambassador discusses the relationship between Russia and China, the relationship between India and Russia, and the relationship between India and China. And I'm not going to summarize all that he says. I don't want to put words into his mouth. I'm going to suggest that if you're interested, and you should be, because I think it was an enormously insightful and important interview, I suggest you go to the program itself. But I am going to add one thing. To my knowledge, I've been hearing this for a long time now, ever since the 2014 crisis, when the Ukraine crisis really got going. To my knowledge, Indian diplomats have been repeatedly warning Western governments that their policy of confrontation with Russia was misconceived. And the Indians were repeatedly telling Western governments that this policy of confrontation with Russia was simply solidifying this relationship between China and Russia. It was causing the Russians to work increasingly with the Chinese in order to deter the West, and that this was not in the West's interests, or, by the way, in India's interests either. And I've been repeatedly hearing that these warnings that Indian diplomats were repeatedly giving were simply going unheeded. Western officials simply ridicule the suggestion that the Russians would ever turn to China in the way that forge a relationship of this intimacy with China in the way that they have done. It was repeatedly suggested that concern about the border, the Chinese-Russian border, would always cause the Russians to keep their distance from Beijing. And in fact, the Indian ambassador in that long interview actually made the diametrically opposite point. He made the point that the border issue between China and Russia has been misunderstood by the West. That far from being a reason for the Russians to seek an alliance with the West against China, Russia's concern to have a peaceful border with China, on the contrary, makes it essential for Russia to have a good neighbour policy with China in order to stabilise and diffuse potential tensions on the border. By the way, it works equally the opposite way round. For China, it's important to have peace on its northern border with Russia. And in fact, this border, far from being an issue of causing conflict between the two countries, is now a reason why the two countries are anxious, have an imperative to maintain a good relationship with each other. I don't think this is very well understood at all in the West. It's clear that in India it is. I'm going to simply add, and I discussed this with one Russian, well-informed Russian, who remembers decision-making during the later Soviet era, that the border conflict between the Soviet Union and China and the Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s and 1970s is today widely understood to have been a catastrophe for the Soviet Union, perhaps the most important single factor in the Soviet Union becoming critically overextended, leading to its eventual collapse. And that, from a Russian point of view, avoiding getting into that kind of situation again is a priority. So the Indians were giving warnings to the Western powers that the Chinese-Russian rapprochement is for real, that Western hostility to Russia would intensify it. We see with the visit of Li Shangfu to Moscow and with the previous visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow, the extent to which this is the case. I'm going to add also, and very briefly, that Li Shangfu's comments, and indeed Putin's comments in that readout, that transcript that I've just read, presuppose the existence of a web of agreements, classified, deeply secret agreements between the Chinese and Russian militaries on a whole range of cooperation, between the militaries of these two countries. The comments that Putin and Li Shangfu make to each other do not make sense unless one acknowledges that these agreements exist. I'm not going to speculate or try to guess what they are, but that they are very extensive and detailed indeed, that they are probably on a comparable level to those of, say, the United States and Britain with each other. Well, it's not difficult, I think, to guess. So, there we are. Western policy towards Russia. It's not pull these two countries apart. There's no sign of Russia reconsidering its relationship with China. On the contrary, it's deepening it. And the Chinese want it to be so, and they will make sure that it remains so. And that precludes them taking any hostile step against Russia. Now, I'm going to finish this program with a discussion about the conflict in Sudan. And I'm going to say straight away that I am not an expert on the politics, the internal politics of Sudan. This is a terrible conflict. It appears to have broken out. It appears to be principally between the Sudanese regular military and a very powerful, very well organized Sudanese militia. The militia was supposed to be absorbed into the military. It looks as if that has all broken down, and we see this conflict as well. But there may be other factors at play, internal, domestic factors, of which I am ignorant. However, I am going to say something further. A couple of months ago, after complex and protracted negotiations, it became known that the Sudanese military, in other words, the regular military, and probably some people from this particular armed faction, this militia, that they'd finally resolved and agreed with the Russians the details of Russia setting up a naval base on Sudan's Red Sea coast. Now, I cannot bring myself to believe that this issue of this naval base Russian naval base isn't playing at least some role in this conflict. Now, there's been a lot of talk about this today in the Daily Telegraph, for example. It's being taken as read that the Russians are somehow involved with this militia that's apparently launched some kind of a attack against the Sudanese regular army, that it's apparently or supposedly received some training and some equipment from the Wagner organization. My own understanding, on the contrary, is that in fact most Russian military contacts, the Russian relationship has been essentially with the regular Sudanese military, not with this militia. And I'm sorry to say that there have been some reports of a kind that one always sees in these sort of events. I can't confirm them, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if they are true, that American and British officials met with some of the leaders of this militia, and there's also some reports that in an air base apparently controlled by the militia, there's pictures of damaged aircraft, one of which appears to come from Ukraine. Now, the United States did undoubtedly lobby the Sudanese government against the agreement to agree to the setting up of this Russian naval base on the Red Sea. And I can't help but think, I'm not certain of this, I can't help but think that this crisis in Sudan is in some way connected with that naval base and with US opposition to it. That in effect, what we are seeing is an attempted coup, US-backed coup, to try to stop this Russian naval base from being established. Now, if that is right, and if the militia were persuaded to launch this coup by the US, and again, I want to stress none of this is confirmed, but there are some indications that this is so, and it would be very consistent with what we know about the way in which things happen around the world nowadays. Anyway, if this is the case, then some reports I have seen suggest that this coup has failed, in the sense that while the militia made rapid ground, was able to seize the presidential palace in Khartoum, in the Sudanese capital, appears to have controlled or achieved control of most of Khartoum at one time. The Sudanese regular military are now taking the initiative. They've been able to break the resistance of the militia in more and more areas, and they're starting to converge against the militia in Khartoum itself. And earlier I saw a report that a prominent figure in this militia, apparently its spokesman, who, as is often the way, actually commands some of the troops of this militia, that he's actually defected to the Sudanese regular military's side. Now, if that's correct, the Sudanese regular military prevails, and if it reestablishes itself in power, and if it is indeed aligned with Russia and with China, then this will have been a coup which will have failed, if it was a coup, which I think it was. If, on the other hand, these latest reports are wrong, and it is the militia that prevails, well, I suspect that we will be seeing another regime change operation successfully carried out in a global south country. So that's, I think, what's probably going on. As I said, I don't know it all for certain. I'm going to finish by just making one observation. I don't understand personally why the Russians want a naval base in the Red Sea. I don't see what conceivable benefit they gain from it. The Russian Navy is growing in strength. Putin has talked about today, in fact, about the importance of developing the Navy, but it's hardly a force to compare with the far more powerful navies of the United States and of China. And the Red Sea does seem to me a long way off from Russia. I can't honestly see the strategic imperative for the Russians to have a base in the Red Sea. So I don't really see what the Russians gain from having a base in the Red Sea, and I don't really see what the danger to the United States of the Russians having a base in the Red Sea is either. If it is indeed the case that this is a US-backed coup that has gone wrong or is going wrong, and if this coup is defeated, or if it results in a civil war in this tormented and unhappy country of Sudan, well, we will see yet again how US policy, in its attempts to prevent Russia and indeed China from establishing relations with various countries, planting the odd naval base here and there, it's prepared, or it has achieved or will achieve, a crisis, a collapse in one particular country in pursuit of some kind of strategic objective, strategic gain, which may look impressive in the State Department and perhaps the Pentagon, but which, as far as I can see, has no great relevance in terms of the world at all. Anyway, that's me for today. No doubt there'll be a lot more about the situation in Sudan over the next few hours, and I will try to comment further on it. But anyway, that's me for the day. And if anyone, and in the meantime, can I just say you can remind you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.